Please don't take screenshots of today's discussion. Thank you so much for cooperating. Also, if you're in the audience today and you have a question, please use the Zoom Q&A function. We'll answer questions from the audience towards the end of today's program. Well, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator today to further introduce our guest speakers, Suzanne and Sharon, and jump into leading what is sure to be an insightful discussion. Over to you, Ankit.
Thank you, Seth, and thank you to NCNK and the US-Asia Institute for sponsoring this very timely discussion. We're just a few days out from the next meeting of the US-ROK Nuclear Consultative Group, so this is a particularly timely moment to reflect as the year closes out. I'm really delighted to have with us here today both Sharon Scassoni and Suzanne DiMaggio, two great experts that I've known for a while, to talk through many of these issues. I will briefly read their bios before introducing many of the themes we'll cover in our conversation today. So I'll begin with Sharon. Sharon is a research professor at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. She's a longstanding specialist on nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, and security for decades and has served in the U.S. government in a variety of roles. Sharon, thanks a lot for joining us today. Suzanne DiMaggio, meanwhile, is my colleague and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East and Asia. She's one of the foremost experts and practitioners of diplomatic dialogues with countries that have limited or no official relations with the United States, including Iran and North Korea. She's led Track 1.5 and Track 2 conversations to help policymakers identify pathways for diplomatic progress on a range of issues, including regional security, nonproliferation, conflict prevention and management, bilateral relations, among others. Thanks a lot for joining us too, Suzanne. So let me set the stage a little bit for our conversation today. We've got two, I think, really interesting sets of issues to talk about. One is, of course, the new developments within the nuts and bolts, the software, so to speak, of the US-ROK Alliance, chiefly the Nuclear Consultative Group, which is a new innovative arrangement that was announced in April earlier this year during President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea's state visit to the United States. This announcement came against the backdrop of increasing anxiety in South Korea about an advancing North Korean nuclear threat and an increasingly more prominent domestic debate there about nuclear weapons and greater demands for signals of nuclear reassurance from the United States for South Korea in this difficult security environment. Meanwhile, we've seen a rather dramatic transformation in North Korea's relationship with Russia. While the two countries have cooperated over a number of years, the nature of that cooperation in recent months has really transformed in a way that we haven't really seen since the end of the Cold War, presenting, I think, the North Korean government with a strategic opportunity of the kind that Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader, probably could not have imagined just a few years ago. So we'll cover the implications of both of these developments and explore where they might intersect, how warming North Korea-Russia ties might impact discussions at the Nuclear Consultative Group and alliance consultations more broadly. But the place I want to start today actually is with the strategic backdrop of warming Russia-North Korea ties, and to hear a little bit from both of our speakers on how they're making sense of these developments. So I have asked them both to prepare a few opening reflections on this, and from there we'll go into our broader conversation today. So Sharon, why don't we begin with you? How are you making sense of the change that we've seen in Russia-North Korea relations? What's the logic that's driving this cooperation, and where might it go?
Well, thanks, Ankit, and thanks to the National Committee on North Korea. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. How am I making sense of this? Well, obviously, I think the war in Ukraine has been the driver for greater North Korean and Russian cooperation. We've seen, you know, everybody's been watching, right? Since July, there have been these high level delegations back and forth. Kim Jong-un went to Russia in September. Lavrov went to Pyongyang in October, and we've all seen the satellite photos of shipments of what we expect to be military equipment, conventional military equipment from North Korea to Russia. On the face of it, it's not clear whether there's really a strategic direction. Russia is in some hot water with regard to its war in Ukraine, and North Korea right now is a somewhat of a convenient ally. At the same time, Russia is cozying up to China, which complicates Pyongyang's diplomatic strategy, right? It likes to play off Russia against China. But I guess I would say it's not clear where this is headed and where it could be headed. And that's one of the concerning things. And this is because Russia traditionally, at least over the last maybe 40 years, has been pretty helpful overall with respect to curbing North Korean proliferation. So it pushed North Korea to join the NPT. It has been helpful, in the six-party talks. What it is doing now with North Korea in terms of if it's going to help, I mean, Putin has said that he would help North Korea build satellites and with a space program. It's another indicator of Russia kind of thumbing its nose at international, not just norms, but UN Security Council resolutions, right? So if this is a harbinger of, Russia not just walking away from all these international norms, but actively undermining them, this could have much bigger implications for where North Korea goes with its nuclear weapons. I've seen speculation, everyone has seen speculation in the press that, Russia could be helping North Korea with its nuclear weapons. It's not clear to me that A, there's evidence there, or B, there's particular motivation. But we sit here in 2023 and none of us would have, or few of us would have predicted what Russia has been doing in Ukraine. So I think we have to be open to these possibilities. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sharon. And right, I mean, I think for anybody who's been working and studying non-proliferation issues, I think the idea that Iran and North Korea would become major suppliers of missile systems and technology to Russia was a scenario that very few people thought about. So I think that call for intellectual humility, I think, is very well placed. Suzanne, turning it over to you, how are you making sense of this? In particular, since you do a lot of work on, of course, diplomacy between the United States and North Korea and in the region more broadly, I'd be curious for your thoughts on how you see the change in Russia-North Korea ties affecting regional diplomatic dynamics in particular.
Thanks. And first, let me thank NCNK and US-Asia Institute for organizing this discussion. And it's a special treat to be doing it with Ankit and Sharon. So I completely agree with everything Sharon's already said. Yes, the North Korea-Russia relationship obviously accelerated significantly since the war in Ukraine, since Russian forces invaded Ukraine back in February 2022. But I would even take it a step further. I think it's a broader transformation that we're seeing in the geopolitical environment that is rapidly evolving. Adversaries like North Korea, as you just mentioned, Ankit, Iran, Moscow, Beijing, are all deepening ties on a range of issues. And the key here is that they would like to see a diminishment of US power, a transition away from power in the West more broadly, seeking a new global order. So that, I think, is the broader context. Pyongyang's support of Moscow since Ukraine has been unequivocal. North Korea was only one of 5 countries to vote against UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia, and Pyongyang formally recognized breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in July 2022. The growing arms trade, which Sharon mentioned, I think is the significant development this year. North Korea has provided, by some estimates, over 1 million artillery shells to Russia just in the last several months alone. There are also reports that North Korea might have transferred ballistic missiles or at least components to Russia for use in Ukraine, as well as mortar rounds and anti-tank rockets. And we should expect to see this continuing in the coming months and perhaps even years. There's also been a flurry of high-level meetings, which has been mentioned. Defense Minister Shoigu joined the Chinese delegation on a visit to Pyongyang in July. Reportedly, he proposed trilateral naval and land force exercises with China. And then, of course, we had the Kim-Putin summit this September in Vladivostok. That was Kim's 8-day visit to Russia. It was his lengthiest trip abroad since becoming North Korea's leader about a decade ago. And then more recently, we saw Foreign Minister Lavrov visit North Korea in late October. Russia's needs from North Korea appear to be narrowly focused on military supplies. In exchange, DPRK will likely receive supplies of food and fuel, possibly much needed hard currency. We also have seen DPRK sharply increase illicit exports of coal by 4 times in the first half of this year. And of course, this is bolstered by lax enforcement of the UN sanctions and potential Russian assistance. And here is a key point. I think the days of Russia and even China are long over of them signing on to condemning North Korea's violations of UN sanctions. In fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov recently referred to the UN security sanctions as being adopted what he called a very different geopolitical times. And I think that is key. He openly signaled Moscow's disinterest in their enforcement and basically provides Kim with a reprieve from diplomatic isolation. Kim's wish list for military assistance include technology related to space launch vehicles, nuclear-powered submarines. He may also seek upgrades for their outdated Air Force. This drew a lot of attention while he was in Russia. Of course, the DPRK and Russia both deny that the arms transfers have even occurred, even though open source imagery has provided pretty good indications of their existence. So these developments pose challenges to the US on a number of fronts, even beyond Ukraine, also to the US-ROK Alliance, which I know we'll talk about. And I would also add to recent advancements in trilateral relations among US, South Korea, and Japan. So these developments in my mind raise a lot of questions. I'll just focus on 2. Yes, we see a significant growth in the arms trade between Moscow and Pyongyang since the invasion of Ukraine. So is this the emergence of an enduring military or economic partnership that will continue to develop in the medium to long term? It's unclear at this point. And I do think there are limitations to cooperation. Russia will be very careful not to cross any of China's red lines when engaging with Pyongyang, such as substantially assisting North Korea's nuclear weapons program. I think it's unlikely that Russia will be willing to transfer sensitive advanced military technology to North Korea. But again, I never would have imagined we be at where we are today. So I think we have to keep an open mind. The other question I have that's related is following the failed summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un in Hanoi. I think we have to ask ourselves against this backdrop, is North Korea even interested at this point in normalizing relations with the United States? It doesn't appear to be the priority for North Korea that it once was. Have we seen a turning point in Pyongyang's strategic calculus? I think North Korea probably sees it has nothing to lose by accelerating trade and military ties with Moscow and Beijing, since there's nothing significant happening with Washington, and there's nothing even on the horizon. So this gets to the question of how do we convince Pyongyang that talks with the United States could still result in attractive benefits? I think it requires more than just reiterating that Washington is willing to meet anywhere, anytime, that common refrain. So I'll stop there, but there are a lot of questions, I think, that we could probably pursue.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that great set of introductory reflections. I think you have both raised a number of questions. To my mind, I think it'll be worth coming back to the issue of how should we think about Security Council resolutions in this new environment where both of North Korea's major bordering states have largely ceased implementation and see their relevance as significantly diminished, especially Russia. I think the point that Suzanne raises about the old pattern, so to speak, where the North Koreans would develop capability and use that capability to build leverage and then come to the diplomatic negotiating table. What happened in 2017 and 2018, for instance? What happens if that pattern doesn't repeat itself as it once did? I think there's a lot to come back to there. But before we do that, I do want to take us now towards the US-ROK Alliance and specifically towards the establishment of the Nuclear Consultative Group. Now, on the face of it, the NCG, as it's known, was not a reaction to Russia and North Korea ties. It was very much a reaction to demands for reassurance in Seoul, and in particular, the growing salience of nuclear reassurance within South Korea, which also takes place against the backdrop of growing calls for an independent nuclear deterrent in South Korea. We saw one meeting of the NCG this summer in July. We're about to see another plenary meeting, and we've seen the United States follow up on the Washington Declaration by demonstrating to South Korea with the arrival of a nuclear power submarine for the first time since the 1980s to Busan, with the arrival for the first time of a nuclear capable B-52 on South Korean soil, and more recently by demonstrating to senior South Korean officials in California the flight test of an American intercontinental range ballistic missile. So the U.S. has tried to reassure South Korea by exploring basically all components of the U.S. Land, sea, and air-based nuclear triad, and otherwise making clear the capabilities and plans that the U.S. has to potentially react to a use of nuclear weapons by North Korea. But Sharon, I wanted to begin with you here. You've worked on nonproliferation and extended deterrence for a very long time. When you look at the establishment of the NCG in South Korea, what do you really take away, and what are your sort of recommendations for where the NCG should go next?
Well, thanks, Ankit. My understanding, or at least in meetings with South Korean experts, that South Korea was looking for something like NATO's nuclear planning group in pushing for this nuclear consultative group. And when you look back at NATO's nuclear planning group, right, it was really designed for two things. One, to ensure, and it has very long standing, right? This was established in 1966, so even before the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was mostly for political reassurance, and I think that this consultative group is designed for the same thing, although it is looking at very specific operational issues. But the NATO Nuclear Planning Group was designed to ensure that US and British nuclear weapons wouldn't be used against the will of those European countries, right? Because we actually had nuclear weapons there. The second thing that it attempted to do was to actually diffuse pressure for, for those of you history buffs, the multilateral force, right? So to diffuse pressure against countries having the ability to use nuclear weapons on their own in NATO. So, the analogy is actually not very apt at this point because we don't have nuclear weapons on South Korean soil, right? But I do think that somewhat, and you won't hear this in official channels, right? That one of the purposes of the Nuclear Consultative Group was to diffuse pressure for South Korea to get nuclear weapons. Now, I know that's controversial, but of course, South Korea is bound by its obligations to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But if you go back to the Washington Declaration, you go back to Yoon's statements, even aside, this is a vibrant discussion in South Korea, right? Because they are quite concerned about a whole range of developments with North Korea's nuclear weapons. Now, the consultative group, I believe, is focusing on very specific, planning, operational, intelligence sharing, and security sharing issues. I think that's all positive. It is also focused on South Korea's conventional or support for U.S. nuclear operations, but from its the conventional force capability. So, and now I've forgotten your original question.
Well, I mean, basically, where do you see the nuclear planning group contributing to the alliance from here? I mean, is this something that's just been set up to address this concern? Concerns on both sides, on the U.S. side about South Korea building nukes and South Korea in terms of demanding U.S. assurance, or can this really contribute to moving the alliance forward in a real way?
Well, a lot about the alliance is about perceptions, right? So, to the extent that South Korea is reassured that the U.S. is taking the security situation on the peninsula very seriously, I think it's helpful. So some of these things, like the visit of the USS Kentucky to Busan, some of these are a little bit of window dressing, right? They do get the North Koreans' attention, right? So North Korean officials were quite exercised about, the visits of these nuclear capable delivery vehicles. But overall, it's really about politics, right? It is really about how reassured South Korea feels. And I think that we've seen this big ratcheting up of consultations. One last point, and I'm sorry for going on. We have the Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultative Group. So this is on top of that. I'm not sure that, you needed to add sprinkles on top of the buttercream frosting on the alliance, but that's where we are. And if that works, then that's positive for the alliance.
Thanks. Suzanne, I wanted to come over to you. In particular, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned trilateral cooperation in your answer, and I think that's, of course, a big part of how the Biden administration has thought about the current environment in Northeast Asia, which is that there's a complete lack of diplomacy or engagement with North Korea, so there's a premium on enhancing deterrence in the context of the bilateral alliance. And then, as we saw at the Camp David summit, which was historic, and certainly very few people, I think, had imagined the Camp David summit being possible, given where we just were with Japan-Korea relations, just 18 months prior, even. But I want to ask you how in particular you think we might get back to a place where not only do we do deterrence with North Korea, but we also begin to, as an alliance, talk about reassurance and potentially creating the conditions for diplomatic engagement again, because this has been a dilemma that the U.S. has faced over the years on the Korean Peninsula, which is a lot of what we might do for our ally out of an intention to reassure can often actually end up making the situation with North Korea aggravated and worse. So I'm wondering how you think about that, or is this something that isn't a priority right now, just given what we're seeing geopolitically with Russia-North Korea ties? So kind of bring that all together for us.
It's a great question, Ankit. Something that preoccupies my mind quite a bit, actually. So, I do think that this, the establishment of the NCG will move the alliance forward because it elevates extended deterrence. coordination. There is some talk that a similar agreement, or maybe this agreement would be extended to include Japan at some point. I don't think South Korea is keen on that idea right now. Maybe there would be a separate agreement, an NCG-like agreement with Japan. We'll see. But I guess the big question here for me is, will the establishment of the NCG and related extended deterrence developments ease Seoul's anxieties over the medium term, over the long term? I mean, what happens when we have the next crisis with North Korea? What if North Korea were to do its 7th nuclear test? The other thing that probably isn't sitting so well with Seoul and Tokyo is the US has increasingly limited bandwidth to focus on Asia due to the demands of the Russia-Ukraine war. There's no end in sight there. Also now we have the Israel-Hamas war, possibility of that becoming a wider regional conflict. So the so-called pivot to Asia has been further delayed, it seems. So I'm just wondering whether our allies in Asia will feel we're not paying enough attention to North Korea's advancing nuclear missiles and surveillance capabilities. So will this cause South Korea's interest in a permanent deployment of US nuclear assets on the peninsula to resurface, or perhaps renew the debate on acquiring its own nuclear weapons capabilities? I think these are questions that we should expect to have to deal with again. I don't think they've been put to bed, so to speak, for good. And then your point of repeated references to deterrence. Clearly, it's very triggering for North Korea. If you look at the statements we've seen just in the last couple of weeks, a few weeks alone, they're quite intense from Pyongyang. Couple that with the renewal of the decapitation strategy, kill chain approach. There is some concern that this could actually have a destabilizing effect, the very thing we're looking to quell. I think we just have to face the fact that we're caught in an escalatory cycle of provocations, measures, countermeasures with North Korea. I don't see any thing on the horizon to make us think that this steady stream of tit for tat show of force moves that we're almost experiencing now on a weekly basis will come to an end. I think the road ahead looks increasingly volatile and unsettling. So we have to ask, yes, the NCG will bolster the alliance, but what will it do to help us address the North Korea problem? And that's where I think the Biden administration has a problem. There's no real strategy there. The last policy review I believe they did on North Korea was early when they came into the administration. Well, a lot has changed since then. We spent the first part of this discussion talking about the changes in the geopolitical environment that none of us, I think, or most of us, did not expect. So that is a big issue for me. And then when you look at the Washington Declaration that happened earlier this year, it's very interesting. There's only one sentence in it that even refers to diplomacy over North Korea. I find that very concerning, and we can talk about that more, but clearly what we're doing is not working, and we do need a new formula.
Thanks. Before we turn it over to the audience for questions, and just a note on that, while we're closing out our moderated discussion, you can put your questions into Zoom, and we'll get those to our panelists. I wanted to ask you both about basically what Suzanne just ended on, about the possibility of where all of this could go wrong, the possibility of deterrence failing, the possibility of a significant action by North Korea kinetically, as a statement just this week suggested that the North Koreans may be willing to do. I think we've seen a lot of concerning dynamics, including the disintegration of the 2018 Comprehensive Military Agreement. North Korea is much more confident with both the backing of Russia and China, a whole new range of capabilities. Around this time last year, we saw a very concerning event where North Korea flew multiple drones into South Korea, which could have easily been misinterpreted as an armed attack. And in retaliation, South Korea actually retaliated in kind by sending its own drones into North Korean airspace. And so we also see a greater acceptance of risk in South Korea, in the political leadership there, against the backdrop of all of this. But the question I want to ask you both, and Sharon, will begin with you on this one, is from where you're sitting, how concerned should we be about the prospect of an unanticipated kinetic clash between the two Koreas? I mean, this is always a lingering possibility. And I think given what we've talked about so far with regard to many of the dynamics, I think many of us didn't really foresee, and the transformation of the geopolitical environment, and certainly of North Korean capabilities. Is this something that we should be thinking about more carefully, or will deterrence in effect hold given where we are on the Korean Peninsula today? So Sharon, let's begin with you on that one.
Thanks, Ankit. Short answer is yes. In that, ironically, a year or two ago, there was a concern that if we attempted to do, some kind of arms control, right, with North Korea, that would legitimize them, and therefore, it would kind of unravel things. And now we're looking at possibly the collapse of, definitely the collapse of P5 agreement on a range of things, and we'll be in a worse situation. The bottom line is, we don't have anything in place with North Korea because we have treated it as a proliferation issue for so many years. We don't have anything in place for crisis stability, for managing those kinds of scenarios where some unanticipated, whether it was accident, whether it was, intended or inadvertent, could escalate out of control. You mentioned the Comprehensive Military Agreement. That was one of the huge bright spots of diplomacy in the last few years, because the North Koreans actually they were quicker to implement some of those things than the South Koreans, right? And that implementation of that would really tamp down some of these perhaps unintended risks. So while I believe that many of these measures that we are undertaking with both South Korea and Japan, and trilaterally, to bolster the alliances are important, I would echo Suzanne's exhortation to get some dialogue going with North Korea, because it is no one's interest that something unintended, whether it's an unplanned encounter at sea, or something you can't even that you would never think would happen, could escalate out of control. And so we do need to sit down with the North Koreans, and we do need to, or even on a track 2 level, find some opening. And maybe that is about, the kinds of things that we did with the Russians on, I'm trying to remember, back in the 70s, on not, no intended risk to go to war. I've forgotten the name of the agreement that we did with the Russians, but so there's a lot we could do there, but the North Koreans themselves have to be open to that. And maybe China, I don't know what was in the the substance of our conversations with the Chinese, but I can't imagine that we wouldn't agree on some kind of crisis stability measures to avoid, unintended escalation.
Thanks, Sharon. I think recognizing that we have common interests in the prevention of an unwanted nuclear war, I think is really important. That's a U.S.-China common interest, and I would argue a common interest that the U.S. and North Korea have. So I think that is a basis for potentially changing policy. But Suzanne, I'd also welcome your thoughts on this, but I want to ask you a related question here, which is, we haven't used the D word, and we're about 40 minutes into this discussion on North Korea, and that's not unusual these days. The word denuclearization doesn't really come up a lot, but of course, any suggestion in Tokyo or Seoul that our policy might no longer privilege denuclearization as the primary short-term objective runs into political headwinds. And so I'd be eager for your thoughts on, first of all, how do you think about the issue of a crisis escalating on the Korean Peninsula? But also, how do we begin to move the needle potentially on not necessarily abandoning denuclearization, but potentially moving towards some of the issues that Sharon identified to make the situation on the Korean Peninsula a lot more stable in the case of a crisis or a limited encounter?
Yes, I think not only would the administration face headwinds from our allies in the region if it was to drop denuclearization, but just think of the hysteria it would unleash on Capitol Hill. So that is something, I think that's just a reality that we have to understand, that the Biden administration is not going to drop denuclearization as a goal. But how we approach it, I think there's a lot of creative space there that they're not utilizing, if I could put it that way. So it's clear, based on what we've just discussed this morning, we have entered a fraught context that requires a different approach, and that focus should be on what is possible. What we need is, we're obviously for this administration, the priority has been a bolstered deterrence approach, dissuasion, coercive policies, etc. That has now been accomplished. What we need now is an overarching goal to develop a pragmatic diplomatic strategy in parallel to deterrence and coercion. And I think now, as we're coming to the end of the Biden administration's first term, this would be a good time to recalibrate that approach. So I think continuing to demand that Kim fully denuclearize is simply unrealistic. It's a little worrying that a few months ago, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan called full denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula our North Star when it comes to North Korea policy. I guess it depends on what he meant. If we're thinking of denuclearization as the immediate goal of any negotiation with the North Koreans, clearly that is not going to happen. But if we think about it maybe as a distant end goal with a very ambiguous timeline, that would be a more sensible approach. Some would call this a crisis prevention or an arms control approach, what I'm advocating. Above all else, I think one of the most important tasks for the Biden administration vis-a-vis North Korea is to establish a sustained and a reliable communications channel with Pyongyang. I think that absolutely has to be the priority. And then if we are able to do that, move to discussions on some of the things Sharon just raised, a channel to focused on conflict prevention, crisis management, things like that. My worry about North Korea is not so much a conflict by design, but one by accident. With all these tit-for-tat escalatory moves, lack of solid communications channels, I do think that the chances for miscalculation are quite great today than, let's just say, even a year ago. And as we talked about this morning, the prospects for diplomacy at a multilateral level, a diplomatic effort, say, among Northeast Asia's major powers, is very unlikely in the foreseeable future. Also, I don't think we can look to the UN to be do it under their auspices because of the lack of agreement between the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So this would be my priority in terms of getting that channel of communication up and running, approaching it in a different way. You know, the bottom line is that even though the Biden administration continues to say we'll meet anytime, any place without preconditions, this is very irritating to the ears of the North Koreans. They see it as a precondition, and that is full denuclearization. We need to be changing the message, changing the formula, and trying out new ways of engagement.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think that's a really good segue into one of the questions we have here from our audience, which builds on just what you said about the possibility of unintended escalation. And it's really a request for you to maybe give us a few more specific risk reduction measures that you might recommend, and possibly measures that could be pursued within a forum like the NCG, which is primarily focused so far on deterrence and capabilities. But what kinds of risk reduction measures would you counsel that the Biden administration and the Yoon administration think about proactively proposing in this environment?
Well, I think a channel that, first of all, would have to be an agenda-setting channel. I think we have to go into this with North Korea with a little humility, asking them what they want to be on the agenda, and then build that agenda from there. They may not want risk reduction on the agenda early on. That would be something we put on the table. Those are the sorts of, I think, dialogue we need to get to. It was very interesting. I think it was this past week or so, in one of the recent statements from North Korea, maybe it was even from Foreign Minister Choi Sang-hui, where she sort of, oh no, it was the sister of Kim Jong-un who said it, gave us a hint of what they don't want to talk about. I mean, she specifically focused on the US demands to do things to their programs and capabilities that are irreversible. That seems to be a trigger point for them. I think they look, perhaps, in my discussions with North Koreans, one of the things that has concerned them is when we reached the JCPOA with the Iranians, part of that agreement, the Iranians had to do things to its program that was irreversible. And when we pulled out, guess what? They were not able to bring their plutonium approach to back online. I think these are one of the things that worry the North Koreans. Also, I think one of the things we have to face is that, you know, because we have reneged on agreements like the JCPOA, the North Koreans don't think that they can enter into a discussion with us in an agreement that would be reliable. The irony is that they see agreements with both Moscow and Beijing as far more reliable interlocutors to any agreements. So I think that's the way I would take the dialogue further. I mean, in terms of risk reduction, it could be simply exchanging information on approaches to how we make decisions on these issues. I think we have to start from basics with North Korea, because we have to remember that after Hanoi fell apart, Kim Jong-un was really humiliated. The idea that he would send a senior team to meet with US officials, you know, we can't count on that. And if it were to happen, we have to be very careful about how we approach that agenda.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think that's all very helpful. Sharon, I think this is a good question for you from one of our audience members. The question is, do you actually see any chance that increased Russia DPRK cooperation could decrease nuclear risks in the region? Maybe the answer to that is just one word, but.
Let me see my crystal ball. I don't really know. I think that is a terrific question. I mean, I don't think that, I don't think that it's in Russia's interests to, fan the flames of a nuclear war in Northeast Asia. I can't see how that serves its interests. And so, but we can't entirely control what Russia does. And I do know, in the context of Iran, many years ago, Russians were much more optimistic about their ability to control their assistance to Iran privately. And so they may also be quite optimistic about their ability to control what they are doing with North Korea. Now, it's not clear to me that they will actually help North Korea to improve its nuclear weapons capabilities. But, in part, I believe that what happens in the war with Ukraine will have a bearing on how far Russia gets pushed into the corner, and that's dangerous. So that's a long non-answer to that question. But again, I wouldn't rule it out. The Russians have strategic interests, right? And it would, I guess, behoove us to persuade them that reducing these risks is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just to chime in. Yes, Suzanne, go ahead.
Just very quickly, I wanted to weigh in on that a little bit. I do think, Russia's key priority, above all else, with North Korea right now is to get munitions to help them in Ukraine, and that's it. That's going to be the priority for months to come. Hopefully not years, but at least the immediate future. So, it is possible that there could be a bit of, I don't want to say an upside to Moscow and Pyongyang's deepening relation, but maybe something short of that. I don't think, given Moscow's military challenges that it's facing in Ukraine, I don't think it has a desire to see a military conflict open up adjacent to Russia's Far East. Certainly, that would be destabilizing. So maybe that is a bit of a silver lining in all this, if we're really forcing us to look at one. I think China here, and I know we're not talking about China too much, but I think maybe China could be more of a stabilizing voice with the North Koreans on this, because clearly they do not want destabilization on the peninsula, given the border and everything else, and their economic problems that they're now facing. But I'll go back to what I said before. I'm not worried about a conflict that arises that's been premeditated or designed. I'm more worried about something that spirals out of control due to lack of communication, misperception, miscues. And I guess that the fact that both of these capitals have solid channels of communication with Pyongyang is a positive thing, but we should have that direct channel with Pyongyang as well. That would make me feel a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about that question, and I think back to 2017, I think one of the reasons many of us worried about Kim Jong-un's so-called itchy trigger finger problem was because he had a fairly small and not very survivable nuclear force, and Now that force is a lot
Right.
bigger, a lot more survivable, and in many ways that actually reduces the incentives for North Korea to resort to early nuclear use in a crisis where the fog of war is thick and misperception is more likely. That's not to say that misperception can't happen, of course. It's just that
Yeah.
compared to 2017, I think that situation has changed. So I guess in a way, if the Russians, the North Koreans, we know, source things like composite materials for solid propellant ballistic missiles from Russia. So to perhaps answer that question, I think maybe some of that will make the North Koreans a lot more confident in their nuclear deterrent. But of course, that raises potentially the problem of a limited coercive conventional attack.
Right.
Speaking of, there is a question from our audience on that I think raises something that's really important in these discussions about the possibility of North Korea resorting to a limited attack, which is, if Kim Jong-un's primary goal is regime survival, what would his motivation to launch an attack on the ROK be? Especially while North Korea is hurting financially, as we've seen with the recent shutdown of some of its embassies overseas. And I think that's an interesting question because if we go back to 2010 and the sinking of the Cheonan and the shelling of Yongpyeong-do, we later, of course, learned that Kim Jong-il had a stroke, and those attacks took place in the context of the internal North Korean succession dynamics. And so today, what would those political dynamics be within North Korea that would give it an incentive to potentially resort to a limited coercive attack against South Korea? Or is this something that might change how concerned we should be about the prospect of the Korean Peninsula spiraling into some kind of crisis? I'll let either of you chime in on that if anybody wants to jump in.
Well, one thing that I've thought about is if there was a kinetic attack, like you just mentioned, Ankit, that we've seen in the past. One question I have, I know it doesn't exactly answer your question, but would Seoul restrain itself from responding? That's something the Yoon administration, it's an open question, I think. How would they respond in some way, or would they restrain themselves from doing that? I don't have the answer to that, but it is something I think we need to think about, that the context in the region, the players have changed to some extent. There is a higher level of tension, decision making in situations of urgent occurrences. We don't know what will happen in that case. So that's something that I think concerns me probably a little bit more than the notion of North Korea launching an attack unprovoked.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to the Washington Declaration, there was a sentence in that declaration that I think few observers really focused on, but it was a pledge to closely connect the new Republic of Korea Strategic Command with the Alliance's Combined Forces Command, presumably to enhance combined operational planning and to reduce the chances that South Korea autonomously responds to a North Korean attack in a way that may be highly escalatory, in a way that the United States may not want to see. So I think that's certainly a live issue that's worth coming back to. So we just have a couple more minutes here, but I know we've really put a lot on the table here for our audience today. So I wanted to briefly turn it over to both of you, beginning with Sharon, to offer any final closing thoughts and reflections, maybe tying up many of the loose threads we've left here. I know we've raised more questions than answers, perhaps, but it is a very dangerous and uncertain environment at the moment. So Sharon, any final reflections?
Yeah, I agree entirely with Suzanne's analysis that we need an opening with North Korea. I don't think, we need to reshape our policy goals. I don't think that denuclearization, I agree that we cannot abandon denuclearization, but how we present that in the context of a long-term objective, and also in the context of, we're an NPT member, right? We ascribe to Article 6 of the NPT, which calls for, general and complete disarmament. We do subscribe to that. even though we don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So if we reshape that narrative, but combine it, and here I want to respond to one of the questions in the Q&A, what kinds of things, how can we open that dialogue? I think there are other perhaps oblique entry points into communicating or cooperating with North Korea. Maybe they have to do with climate change. Maybe they have to do with certain nuclear safety issues, which are not entirely, which we could put on the table, but we'd have to do it quite carefully. So I think we need to kind of zoom out a little bit. This was a criticism of our approach to Iran, right? It was all nuclear, nuclear, nuclear. That's what we do with them. I think we need to zoom out a little bit and see if there are other potential entry points into at least establishing a dialogue. I think that climate change mitigation, certain things dealing with the East Sea and the West Sea, could actually be helpful. It's a very long-term project, though. You're not going to see benefits in the short term. And so that is one of the challenges we have with our political system. But I don't think that there's kind of a moment to lose. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sharon. Suzanne, any final thoughts?
Yes, I'll be brief. I think we have to keep asking ourselves as we build up our deterrent capabilities with our allies in the region, we have to keep asking ourselves, is our approach reinforcing the cycle of escalation? And if so, how do we recalibrate to address that problem? As I mentioned before, the Washington Declaration only dedicates one sentence to diplomacy with DPRK. And in my mind, a key goal of deterrent measures should be to provide space and opens up a path to diplomatic engagement. Right now, we don't see any diplomatic off-ramp in sight. DPRK is becoming more and more reliant on Moscow and Beijing for its survival. So I would say, and some may find this provocative, but I think in order to get where we need to go, it likely will require the Biden administration to take a conciliatory step towards Pyongyang, and what that could be in form of sanctions relief or something. Certainly, they're not going to do that in a presidential election year. But let's set the table for something in January 2025.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne. And thank you both for sharing all of your insight today on this terrific panel discussion. I know there's a lot of questions, so hopefully we'll be able to come back and continue to talk through these issues as the situation develops. If you're in the audience today and you're interested in staying connected, please do check out more from USAI and NCNK as future events are made available. And for more North Korea content, past and present, including a recording of this webinar to catch what you missed, we encourage you to find the National Committee on the YouTube channel. So heartfelt shout out one more time to both NCNK and USAI for making today's webinar possible. And finally, one more big thank you to both Sharon and Suzanne for joining us and sharing their insights. So this concludes today's webinar. Have a great afternoon and hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.